Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Antisemitism, Homophobia, and Transphobia Walking Together.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very timely and important topic. My name is Michael Soto, and I'm the Chief Advocacy Officer for One Community. As many of you know, One Community is the coalition of socially responsible businesses, organizations, and individuals who are moving diversity, inclusion, equity, and equality forward in Arizona. Today, we want to talk with our amazing panelists, and folks, they're incredible. I'm so excited for you to meet these incredible people about our growing nexus between anti-Semitism, homophobia, and transphobia. Given the state of the world, this is a difficult but important conversation to have. So please feel free throughout our conversation to drop questions in the chat, and we will do our very best to cover them all. As LGBTQ Americans, we know what it's like to have violent extremists, including terrorist groups like Hamas, attempt to target and kill us for who we are and for who we love. The murder of innocent people is never justifiable. We know all too well that any group dedicated to hate is an existential threat to all marginalized people. Further, we know all too well what it's like to realize that people we have counted on to speak with a voice of moral courage when they're silent in the face of our destruction and threats to our very lives and our communities. So with that, I want to share a little bit with you about well, actually, no. First, I want to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and share a little bit about their work. So incredible folks. I'm gonna call on Paul and ask Paul to kick us off.
Great. Well, shalom, friends. Thank you for having me. My name is Paul Rockower. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Phoenix. We do the strategic communications, the diplomacy, conflict management for the Jewish community, other vulnerable communities across the valley. When we're not dealing in crisis, which is often here in Arizona, we do advocacy, interfaith outreach, and community bridge building on behalf of the Jewish community. We help the Jewish community to communicate what keeps us up at night, and we help the Jewish community understand what keeps other communities up at night. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here, Paul, and thank you for all the work that you do in Arizona. It's so important. Kate, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Kate Bitz. I use pronouns like she and her. I am a program manager and trainer/organizer with Western States Center in our program on countering white nationalism in the United States. And I'm based up in Spokane, Washington.
Thank you so much for making time to be with us and for your incredible work. That is not an easy lift, so thank you. Eddie.
Thank you so much. Shalom. Buenas tardes. Good evening. I'm so happy to be a part of this phenomenal panel with just an amazing group of human beings who I absolutely adore. My name is Eddie Chavez Calderon, he, him, his, él. I am the campaign director of not only Uri Letzedek, which is an Orthodox progressive social justice organization, but also Arizona Jews for Justice here locally. And we provide avenues for a lot of our local Jewish community to be there for a stranger. Ultimately, being our key mission is to stand up for the stranger. And we do that on different avenues, making sure that we are there for vulnerable populations by providing direct need to those experiencing homelessness, to supporting our migrants who are being freshly released from detention centers. And we do that collectively, empowering the Jewish community to make change. And it connects a lot of us in the community to stand together with those who are the most marginalized in our times right now. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, Eddie, thank you for being with us and thank you for the work you do. The Jewish community in Arizona is so intersectional and so invested in allyship. And I know your work and Paul's work has a lot to do with that. So thank you both. So for our audience, a lot of our folks are LGBTQ folks or allies of LGBTQ folks, and we're really familiar with homophobia and transphobia. But I think for us to understand the intersection of anti-Semitism, homophobia, and transphobia, I want to ground us a little bit, give us a little background on this nexus. So I'm going to switch to some slides real quick. It's just a couple, I promise. I won't be too professorial. And then we'll go back to our brain trust in this amazing panel. So let's start with what is anti-Semitism? I think this is a really important question, and I wanted to share the sort of official definition. It's not a legally binding definition, but it's a definition that's accepted by the United States, the EU, and many countries around the world. So anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Its rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish and non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. And so I think really simply, anti-Semitism is hatred of Jewish people, right? And rhetoric and actions against individuals and property that manifest that hatred. So it's a really important thing to understand because I don't think we talk about anti-Semitism enough in the United States in non-Jewish communities. So I want to make sure that we ground in that. I'm going to ask our panelists all to weigh in as well and sort of help flesh this definition out so that we have an even better understanding of it. But as a baseline, and then I wanted to share a little bit of information about hate crimes because we're seeing in the past, actually since the pandemic, we've seen hate crimes rising kind of across the board in this country. And alarmingly, we've seen a big rise in both the LGBTQ and the Jewish communities. So hate crimes against our two communities have both been exponentially increasing, but especially the Jewish community. In this year, since October 7th, we've seen the ADL has cited a 388% rise in reported hate crimes and reported incidents against the Jewish community. In the same period last year, there were 64, whereas there were 312 this year, according to the statistics that I found for sort of the end of October, beginning of November. And those have been even more, I'm sure, since then. The FBI reported that the number of anti-Jewish hate crimes jumped by 36% in 2022 from the previous year, and for the LGBTQ community rose by 19%. So as you can see, we've got this rise happening for both of these communities, which isn't good, right? And we can see a connection that when hate crimes are rising for any community, right, they tend to rise for many communities. Additionally, the hate crimes in the beginning of this month reported that their investigations have increased by 60% since October 7th of anti-Semitic hate crimes, that the Jewish community is the most targeted and has experienced the greatest increase in crimes. Also, other communities like the LGBTQ community and also the Muslim community have seen an increase. But it's really important to note, and I thought this was interesting from the FBI saying this, that in the US, we are reaching historic levels of anti-Semitism. And so that's something we really need to be aware of during this time. I thought this was a really interesting quote from an article, and this was from February of 2023, kind of drawing, so just discussing hate crimes in general. Demonizing people is the first steps in committing violence. And so this was from the Associate Director of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and she's based in Toronto. She said, when so many different communities are affected by the same forms of hate, wearing different hats, the worst thing we can do is turn our backs. And so I think that's, a big piece of kind of what I want you to take away from these statistics is that hate is rising and that it has similar forms and it's interconnected. In fact, in Arizona, we've been seeing hate crimes rising for quite a while, anti-Semitic hate crimes. And as you can see in 2021 and 2022, those are pretty big jumps. Unfortunately, I think as statistics are collected on this year, that's going to be even worse. And so here's just a little bit of a baseline to give us a little bit of an understanding as a community and an audience that maybe isn't as familiar with anti-Semitism. But now let's go to our amazing and incredible panel. So we see, that hate is connected, right? We understand this as communities of marginalized people. So what do we need to know specifically about this, the ways that you are seeing, or what are you seeing in terms of the connections between anti-Semitic hate crimes and hate crimes in general, especially against the LGBTQ community in your work? And I'll let whoever wants to go first. Paul, jump on in.
Sure. Well, Michael, thank you for that. And I'll, Eddie, unmute yourself as well, dive in here as well. And Kate, I think we can have a real free-for-all discussion. One thing I wanted to kind of point out with anti-Semitism is it's not just hatred of the Jewish community, it's also the tropes, the stereotypes. You know, it's not always just hatred of the Jewish community. It's also the putting out in the public sphere the perceptions of the Jewish community in ways that are harmful or, you know, or unfair or unjust, or focusing on the Jewish community in ways that you wouldn't focus on other communities. You had mentioned kind of that intersection of hate, and that's very much the case here in Arizona. We do a lot of monitoring of extremism, and frankly, the two communities I deal with the most in terms of trying to keep safe are the LGBTQ community and the Jewish community. And frankly, you could have an interchange of who I'm more worried about given the week. We do a lot of monitoring, and frankly, the amount of neo-Nazi threats against the LGBTQ community has kept me up at night as much as it's kept up, you know, the Jewish community. I mean, dealing with neo-Nazi threats to Flagstaff Pride, to Phoenix Pride, to all sorts of things, you know, those who hate the Jewish community often hate the LGBTQ community and often use similarly coded rhetoric. Some of the stuff we see, the stereotypes that they put forward, or the focus on things often can be interchangeable. And we can talk about a little bit more of that in what is tropes. I do want to be careful in that when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we have to be careful of where anti-Semitism is thrown out as a charge, you know, especially with all of the rhetoric going on. You know, you can be critical of the state of Israel and not be anti-Semitic or not be anti-Israel. But if you call for the destruction of the state of Israel, then you're kind of crossing a line. And there are lines of being critical of the Israeli government's policy, which is fair game, versus demonizing the state of Israel, putting forward, you know, tropes or libel about the Jewish community, or holding the Jewish community, you know, for actions in Israel that, you know, crosses a line. You know, and we can talk a lot about this because there's a lot to talk about in terms of hatred against the Jewish community, against the LGBTQ community here in Arizona, against the Muslim community as well. We do a lot of work trying to protect the Muslim community and keep them safe, because often it is the same folks. I mean, we've flagged neo-Nazi threats to Palestinian rallies since October 7th. You know, there's a lot of hate in Arizona. As I was commenting to the panel before, you can't spell Nazi without AZ, and that's very much the case here in Arizona. With that said, the upside of this is we have a lot of communities who are vulnerable working together to try and push back against hate, so that no community deals with hate alone. One community is a tremendous partner in that. We've worked with the LGBTQ community, we work with the Black community, the Latino community, Muslim community, to make sure that no community deals with hate alone in Arizona. And that's really, I think, the best thing we can do is stand against hate together.
So powerful, Paul. Absolutely. And oh my gosh, I cannot count the number of times we have been on emails or Zooms or phone calls talking about threats against our community, all of our communities. And that has been a shocking thing. It's the same people, right? It's white nationalists, white supremacists, right? It's people that hate. It seems like they just hate people that are different than them, and they come after all of us at different times. So yeah,
a lot of othering. I'm sure Kate can speak well to that, you know, about
yes.
the othering factor.
I think a big factor here too is a lot of the work that I do as someone who is a queer woman but is not a Jewish person. It really involves studying and figuring out how to address anti-Semitism, because we're dealing with folks who are targeting all of our communities, whether that's us as LGBTQ plus folks, Jewish communities, Muslim communities, immigrant communities, Black communities. There's a reason why we are all part of that picture. And that reason is that it's coming out of a coherent worldview, if a very disgusting one, that our opponents have, right? So especially when we're talking about anti-Semitic tropes, so many of those emerge from really long-standing conspiracy theories that are always going to reinvent themselves, that always resurface at certain times in our societies throughout the West. So, I mean, it is worth talking, I think, about how LGBTQ plus people fit into this picture of our opposition's worldview. And I think it was really after Pride in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho last year, which was targeted by a white nationalist group, Patriot Front, that's about 30 miles away from me. You know, shout out to North Idaho Pride Alliance. They're doing amazing work. Just hired their first part-time executive director. So a little plug there for the folks up north. I found myself on the phone with reporters who were asking me, why are white nationalists going after LGBTQ plus people who are mostly not people of color in this case, who are not Jewish people? Why is that happening? And what I found myself doing is backing up and saying, look, you know, bigots do not see our community as a normal, just natural part of a diverse human family that's always been there. We've gone by many different names and social roles, but we've always been part of the picture. That is not what they believe. They think that we are indoctrinated into our identities. They think we've had our heads spun around somehow to love people who we're not supposed to have gender identities that we're not meant to have. And once you start to ask them who is doing that indoctrinating, it goes in a really predictable direction. It's the media, it's powerful, shadowy interests, it's Hollywood. Paul is giggling because he knows exactly what that coded language is supposed to mean. On the most explicit end of things, there have been thousands of neo-Nazi flyers dropped at people's doorsteps over the past 3 years that very clearly claim that Jewish people are responsible for turning us queer and trans, right? We are supposedly victims of horrible indoctrination. I would not say that's my life experience. And this, you know, as we've kind of seen our community spaces, our cultural events, our stories in libraries, our medical care targeted, we've seen people across this white nationalist and anti-democracy spectrum start to say the quiet part out loud, which is that we're being targeted right now because this bigoted narrative about both our community and the Jewish community, that's working for them tactically right now. It is allowing them to gather support. It is allowing them to draw people further into those harmful worldviews. And, you know, I don't think we've seen many examples of this in the 2023 off-year election, but they also think it's helping them build political power to target us like this.
Oh my gosh, Kate, thank you so much for kind of pulling the cover off of all of that and helping us see this this worldview that does see all of us, right? That sees Jewish people, LGBT people, Muslim people, Black folks, right, Latino folks as not fully human, and how those tropes and stereotypes are deeply seated in their worldview and really extend to all of us. And so also the political power piece, really important. I think that's why we've seen this rise in anti-LGBTQ state legislation, right? Like that's, these extremists believe that they are building political power by blaming us, whether we're LGBT people or Jewish people or both, or any of it, any combination, both communities, for the troubles, right, of other people, or the challenges of this time. So Eddie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. Oh my goodness, so much to agree on here, and scary to talk about these topics, right? But I think that these are the type of uncomfortable conversations that we really need to have, that a lot of us think that in some spaces things are just black and white. But I also want to really highlight the fact that anti-Semitism and a lot of homophobia doesn't always look as black and white as we think, right? It doesn't always look like a straight insult, a straight offensive insult to both queer and the Jewish community. There's anti-Semitism that sneaks its way into our communities, right? Where it's also looked upon as a part of maybe even a compliment, right? Like, oh my goodness, I'd love to be friends with Jews. They have so many connections to so many different things, right? That's a compliment. Why wouldn't you want to be excited that you have so many connections and you have so much funding? I don't know where the funding is. I would love to know, but these
You
are
don't get your
common.
Soros check.
Right. And these are just common misconceptions, or labeling the queer community to have some sort of sense of fashion and saying, well, I didn't know that this was, offensive. I'm being I'm giving you a compliment. And that's where it really starts to dive even deeper into some scary stuff. And I think that the biggest highlight of this type of hate that comes both towards the Jewish community and to queer communities is its simple but vicious jump to violence, where we tend to not really see that in other forms of other hate, right? With xenophobia and folks looking at me as a formerly undocumented Mexican, they probably want me out of the country, right? But that's typically where it stops, right? Get out of my country, the problem solved. But for trans folks, they look at them as they want them gone out of this world. When they look at the Jewish community, they want them gone out of this world. And when we start to walk the path of dehumanization and using verbiage that dehumanizes an entire people, then it becomes easier to look at people as less than and more of a conflict or an issue. So then once the erasure of that, it's easier to commit atrocities. It's easier to commit hate, and it's easier for us to validate that hate, right? So when we see the validation of communities saying, well, I don't care what communities do in their own home, but you're not going to indoctrinate my children. I am now putting myself in a moral high ground, right? When I say, well, I'm not here to, tell the Jewish community what to do, but they can't put it in my face and they can't control my bank. And the reason why my house is going into foreclosure, then it starts to say, well, I'm here fighting the good fight. And I think that a lot of us have good intentions, even in our own biases. Because to say that we don't have our own biases is just frankly wrong, right? To say that we don't have our own biases is just completely wrong, my friends. But even to challenge ourselves and to think about how quickly a lot of notions and tropes that even we can passively say can lead to direct violence of both queer communities, Jewish communities, and intersecting communities. As we know that the Jewish community is a widespread of identities, customs, colors, smells, looks, flavors, you name it. We come in all types of sizes, shapes, and flavors. Just like in the entire queer community, it's hard to just label one thing into being one thing. So I think that it's a crucial role for us to understand how quickly a lot of the notions could lead to some really scary violence.
Can we delve a little deeper into tropes, conspiracy theories, and misinformation doesn't even feel like a strong enough word, but I'm seeing so much that these ideas about indoctrinating children, or these ideas about sort of these very long, very, very wrong concepts, but long held by hateful groups. I think this is a really important area for people to learn about. So can you all share a little bit more about this and why we should all be learning more, educating ourselves, and not believing this misinformation, and what we can do to kind of get out of those misinformation loops and into reality?
Where to start? I mean, anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred, known to man. It takes so many different forms. It has been, it morphs in so many different ways. I mean, we could spend a whole hour just, looking at the tropes. I mean, I think it's important just to understand some of the base of what is anti-Semitism, of what some of the most common tropes are. The idea of globalists, or that the Jews are rooted to their own community, not to the country they live in. or the idea that Jews are shadowy and control things, like the Soros trope. You can disagree with George Soros's policy, fine. There are a lot of people who do. But when you use George Soros as an anti-Semitic boogeyman who's controlling behind the scenes and using that for political power and trying to, indoctrinate your followers, then you've got a problem. And that's really, you can have a very honest conversation of disagreement with George Soros and his policies, fine. But when you use him as a symbol, and when the Jewish community is used as a symbol, then it becomes anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitic trope, a bigger issue. And I think it's important that we kind of unpack that long history and how also you see some of what has been traditional anti-Semitic language or rhetoric or tropes now being used on the LGBTQ community, because you've got a playbook that works well. And also understanding that conspiracy theories, I mean, when you go down the well of conspiracies, it's always the Jews at the bottom. It's always, when you get to the bottom of that conspiracy well, it's always the Jewish community. We're always the answer to all of society's ills, because we don't fit, because we're different, because we have different beliefs, because we look the same, because we don't look the same, because we dress the same, because we don't dress the same. It's so multi-layered and multifaceted, but at the end, it just comes down to fear and to othering and to, the use of politics for nefarious means. I mean, full stop. Eddie, Kate, you want to jump in here on some of this?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that a lot of these tropes fall upon what's the easiest way to blame things that's not intersectional and not looking inward, right? It's a easy way to blame another group of people for the issues of the world. It's an easy way to blame, a broken education system on a certain group and say, like, well, my fault, my fault. It's not my fault that I voted against better funding of our education system. It's not my fault I did that. It's the indoctrination that my children are getting. It's not my fault that we are moving towards a level of uneducation. We have one of the lowest rates of students being at grade level reading. And instead of looking inwards and seeing what are the systems that are really affecting us inward and collective with the funding that we're looking at, it's easier for us to just say, well, it's the queer community and the queer agenda. It's easier in that also phase to say, well, what's happening with the world, the economy, COVID, that's the Jews. It's an easy fallback thing to do, to be able to fall into these notions and fall, frankly, into conspiracy theories. And I honestly think that none of us are immune to conspiracy theories. And I mean that so wholeheartedly. And I don't mean that in a way that's offensive. I mean that in the way that sometimes we just don't know what we don't know. And sometimes things pull us into like, oh, okay, that kind of adds up. But the point is, we all have to have that point of critical thinking of saying, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't add up at the end, right? Our education is faulty, but I don't think it's necessarily because drag queens are having a fun time on a Sunday. Or I don't think it's the drag queens that are reading books, children's books to our folks. I don't think it's the synagogue that just lit up a menorah and they're the reason why COVID-19 happened, right? Like, it's not that aspect. Like, we have to be very careful with the notion of what we're trying to explain. And when we're diving into a lot of theories that end up being very harmful, and a lot of notions and tropes that even seem like they are good, like they seem like there are positivity behind them, right? And I think that a lot of us really get into falling into our own implicit biases that we have towards both of these communities. And I'll finish off with saying this, that the best way to dispel a lot of myths, a lot of tropes, is through friendship, education, and consistent community engagement. That's how we break through a lot of these things. As an organizer, I don't know where I would be without the queer community who led me and taught me how to organize. I don't know where I would be. myself not identifying as queer, but every grassroots level of organizing that I know now was gifted to me and educated to me by queer communities. And we saw the power of intersectionality and collective power that sees the uplifting of both communities and not at the cost of one or the other.
Amen to that.
Yeah, that is a word.
Yeah. I just want to jump on what Eddie said. I mean, really, like, we understand, you know, to have an ally, you have to be an ally. And the time to meet your neighbors is not when your house is on fire, not when their house is on fire. So we're very intentional in creating relationships with communities that are threatened here in Arizona so that we stand together and that we're making sure that no community deals with hate alone. Eddie made a very good point about the emotional transrational connections and understanding that you don't reach people through rational information, you reach them through emotional transrational connections that come through, you know, those people-to-people connections. I mean, in my previous work in public diplomacy, that was through music and food and art and dance and culture, but those build those people-to-people ties in terms of advocacy and storytelling. That's what I give one community tremendous credit for. You all are phenomenal storytellers on behalf of the LGBTQ community. You tell that good story, and you do that to the communities that matter most here, the business community and the faith community, and you meet people where they're at, which is what I give you all some real credit for. I think one thing that we have to throw in there of what has exacerbated the situation is social media, Twitter, X, whatever that cesspool is called these days. Like, it's been just garbage and really has exacerbated the situation for the Jewish community, for the LGBTQ community. It makes it so easy to push conspiracies. It makes it so easy to, you know, to ramp up indoctrination. And frankly, we don't have the tools yet, you know, as our education system has been stripped down, as social media is becoming more rampant. And I mean, especially you've seen this in social media around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the most complicated conflicts in the world is reduced down to memes and tweets. Like, you can't do that. These are, you know, this is literally one of the most complicated, complex situations on the planet. If you've got an easy answer, you're frankly selling garbage. Like, I'm sorry, that's the truth. If you want to understand this, get off social media, go to your library, you know, while they're still open, while you can still access some books there, and get a deeper understanding in all of this. But Kate, you wanted to jump in there. I don't want to steal your fire.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and it's so easy for us as community organizers to say everyone needs to be educating themselves, right? Well, this is probably one of the worst moments to try educating yourself on one of the most protracted and tragic situations that's happening in the entire world right now, right? Just seeing the ways that misinformation is not only spreading, but is also monetized. We've actually seen specific anti-LGBTQ plus influencers turn to pushing content that may or may not be a video from Gaza. It might be from Syria 3 years ago. And because they're verified on Twitter, I don't recognize X, like, they are able to monetize that for themselves. Like, we have seen people switch from one kind of propaganda to another because that's what's trending. So yes, educate yourself. Try and do that through conversations, try and do that through books, try and do that through verified sources. And please do just Google things or scroll a couple months back in somebody's timeline before you share something out, because a lot of these folks really are just trying to spin things. Another piece that I always think of when it comes to conspiracy theories is, you know, the bigotry of it all is very harmful. It certainly drives violence. Another piece to the puzzle of all of this is that conspiracy theories tell you there's nothing you can do to change your world. It's very disempowering to believe that there's some shadowy group behind the curtain that is running everything. It prevents you from having a accurate power map of what's actually going on in your community, the reason why the rent's too high, the reason why minimum wage is too low. There are real reasons behind some of these things that are, you know, terrible influences on our community and our wellness. If we're just pointing at conspiracy theories to explain it, we're telling ourselves that there's nothing we can do, and that is never true.
Oh my gosh, y'all are so brilliant. This is all just such important information and my head is like bursting with ideas. I wanna go to a couple of questions that we've received. I'm gonna kind of reframe this question because y'all talked about social media and how that's contributing to conspiracy theories and to these tropes and all of these things that fuel anti-Semitism and anti-LGBTQ hate. Do you think, can we talk a little bit about public education and perhaps the attacks on teaching accurate history, right? When that comes to race, when that comes to LGBT people, when that comes to the Holocaust, when it comes to anything, is that also impacting the way, especially young people, are understanding this moment for in terms of Israel and Palestine, LGBT people, anything? What do you all think of that? The impact on public education? Yeah, Paul?
Well, I'm going to ask for all the panelists to join me here, since education is not the area we most work in. But I would say, I mean, yes, you're dealing with, some of the most complex, historical situations of which it's getting short shrift in public schools. You're not getting the full education, so you get people who turn to social media to try and understand it better, and that's probably the worst place you could turn. Crack open some books and get a better, deeper understanding. And we don't do a very good job of teaching history of American history, let alone world global history, to understand complexity, the long standing. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict didn't begin, in October. It didn't begin in 2003. It didn't begin in 1987. It goes back about 100 years. And if you think it's a centuries or millennia old conflict, you're wrong. My background is in Islamic and Middle Eastern studies with a focus on Jewish communities in the world of Islam. That's what I studied in undergrad. And if you look at the scope of history, the Jewish community was fleeing persecution in Christian Europe and finding haven and tolerance in North Africa, in the Middle East, in the Ottoman Empire. So there is a lot to unpack in the Middle East complex, in the conflict, but you really have to dive in a lot deeper. And I don't think we're getting close to that. We're not getting close to any deep history. I mean, go look at the history of Reconstruction. There's a great Atlantic article. I mean, the whole Atlantic Monthly this month is on the history of Reconstruction, and stuff we don't even scratch the surface on in high school. One thing I just wanted to track back on one of the comments Kate made about social media. Kind of the Achilles heel of America is it's very easy to monetize hate in a lot of spaces, and that we do that on TV, on cable television news. We do that in these social media platforms. I mean, the ability to monetize hate and fear in America is profound, and that is part of what is driving the insecurity of the Jewish community, driving insecurity of the LGBTQ community. It's very easy to monetize and to share hate in that space. And if you don't have people who are better educated, if you don't understand the lessons of the Holocaust, if you don't understand that the lessons of genocide in other places, I mean, you see how that incitement, if you don't understand how incitement leads to violence in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in the Holocaust, in all of these spaces, if you don't have a grasp of that, then we're repeating these patterns of historical conflict.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that we also tell the story of America in this one-sided way, right? Where we're always trying to frame our history as us being the good guys and whoever we're up against being the bad guys, when often there's a whole nother story there. Reconstruction is a perfect example of actually not only that entire dynamic of how we try to morally flatten things in our education, we don't address power dynamics, we don't talk about things in detail, but Reconstruction was also the time period when we saw the first integrated public school systems in some of our southern states. Like, under these multiracial Reconstruction governments, people were building roads, they were creating infrastructure, they were putting together public schools, making sure everyone could read. And education is a key part of liberation for all communities. So when we do see people trying to shrink down education, make it one-sided, shut down conversations that we need to have, like, we need to understand that as an attack on our kids' ability to understand complex situations, but also as an attack on our whole democracy.
You can't have democracy without educated citizenry, and frankly, we are failing at left and right.
Yeah, I think that's something though, is I walk a pathway that I think is a little bit different in progressive spaces and what we see, where I walk a pathway of deep empathy and deep love. And I walk with the notion of thinking that everybody, at least in my opinion, I know some folks really do have really bad intentions, but I think that everybody has really good intentions that end up missing the mark on bad impacts. And when I look at education and when I look at the way that folks can be sharing miseducation, and I see this a lot with the rise of like QAnon and far right extremism, where if I were to want to have a dialogue with somebody and I would be like, you know what you're sharing is not true. I wouldn't automatically go and say, you're racist, you're a bigot, you're this, you're xenophobic, all this and that, because people shut down immediately after that. People are not going to listen to you. As soon as those conversations are brought in, people completely shut down. When somebody shares something that's inherently anti-Semitic, I always think, well, this person probably is advocating for a just cause that they think is coming at from a good place of heart. And I explained first with leading with that compassion side, and then say, here's where it hurts our community and why it hurts our community. Here's where you're driving into some anti-Semitic tropes, or vice versa in queer communities where somebody could share something, an article per se that, some person did some sort of violence, sexual violence, happened to be queer. Pushing that narrative really hurts a lot of communities, really and tends to ignite a flame that is used to hurt other people. So when we're talking about these things, I look at a way of bringing in people, but I'm very selective with that. I'm not talking about the people who want me inherently dead. They may not be ready for those conversations. They may not be safe for me to have those conversations. But the people that are mistakenly sharing things due to negligible ignorance, due to just simply not knowing, why am I going to then shut them down and lead them towards another pathway that ends up hurting them, hurting me and them even more, and getting them to being in a worse place, than they were before. And I think that also falls in line with our education system. I think that we also see the same issue that we saw before with internet, where our parents would tell us, don't believe what's on the internet. When we were growing up in the path of internet, I remember my mom would say, don't believe what's on the internet. Don't believe what's on the internet. Now I'm the one telling my mom, don't believe what's on the internet. Don't believe what's happening. And I'm the one telling my sister, don't believe everything that's on TikTok. Don't believe everything you see on Instagram. Because anybody can make an infographic that dehumanizes communities and leads to violence. Anybody can be an educator, right? Everybody has an opinion. Everybody's so creative. I love that meme, and I love that because it's true, right? Like, there should also be a point to step back and say, you know what? I'm actually not a person that has a credible opinion here. And it's okay for me to be quiet. I don't need to be vocally loud at this moment. My voice doesn't need to be heard in me telling queer communities where queer communities should be advocating for or directing their voices. I'm not directly affected. I don't need to have an opinion in these spaces. If it's called upon me by those who are directly affected, then yes, I'm super supportive to uplift, but my voice isn't the most necessary. And it's okay to be quiet sometimes. It's okay to just listen, learn, and then reach out to folks who are directly impacted. That's how I think that both in our education system, both in our community system, and both even with working with our elders, we're able to make such transformative work when we start to take those approaches of leaning in with a little bit more compassion. Because I feel like even in our movement today, we're moving less and less away from compassion and more into absolutism, which I think that the movement towards queer marriage was a movement of compassion and love that led with compassionate love, and this is why it was successful. And I think that we need to take back the idea of all or nothing situations, and to think of absolutism as a complete gateway to win, and take a step forward with compassion and empathy and treat each other with that notion of how we would take care of each other.
Thank you, Eddie. I think you inadvertently answered the second audience question about how do we help people who have sort of fallen into the extremist thinking of QAnon or white nationalism or any other extremist thinking. How do we help them out? And this, connection, relationships, educating ourselves so we can gently educate other people and lovingly bring them out. So important. Kate and Paul, do you have anything to add to that of how do we help people that we love sort of get out of these really scary ways of thinking?
Kate, you want to field this one?
I think I'm uniquely poorly positioned to answer this question because as someone who does active organizing against white nationalism, it's pretty unsafe for me to be involved in outreach. People might want my help getting out of extremism for any number of reasons. What I tend to suggest to folks is, first of all, as Eddie was mentioning, make sure that this is a safe situation for you. Get the assurances that you need in order to be in conversation. And then, my suggestion would be to lead with curiosity. So if someone tells me something absolutely ridiculous, my first question, partly because I'm nosy and I do a lot of research, but partly because I think it's helpful, is, oh, really? I have never heard that before. Where did you hear that? Where are you reading that? Let's take a look. And that tells me a lot more about what kind of media environment this person is currently embedded in. Where are they getting these ideas? Who is feeding this stuff to them? What strategy might be behind that? And that can inform my own next steps in terms of saying, well, I'm not so sure about this. Let's take another look at this source. These are also strategies that Western State Center advocates in a lot of our written resources. So we do have a guide for parents and caregivers who are seeing their kids maybe get wrapped up in some of this stuff, as well as a schools toolkit that addresses some ways to handle this in a school community or classroom.
Oh my gosh, I would love for us to be able to share those toolkits with the audience. And Kate, thank you so much for reminding us personal safety is really important in this, because extremism is violent, right? And it especially targets LGBT people, Jewish people, women, trans people, right? Like, we are especially vulnerable to that kind of violence. So thank you.
I want to talk just a little bit more about that sense of vulnerability and how profound that is for the Jewish community right now. I mean, we've just continually seen increases in anti-Semitism for years on end, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. I mean, I spent the whole High Holy Day season dealing with synagogue bomb threats. This is something that no other community deals with on such a consistent basis. And this is how I spent my Rosh Hashanah and my Yom Kippur, was worrying about bomb threats to synagogues across the state, and just when we thought things were kind of maybe quieting down, we then had this tremendous explosion of anti-Semitism. And I just wanted to highlight to everyone who's on this, the Jewish community feels very vulnerable. It feels very alone. And I'm grateful for One Community for their strong stand to support the Jewish community. I'm grateful for Western State Center's just tremendous allyship. They've been partners against extremism from the minute I got here. I just wanted to highlight, this is a very difficult time for the Jewish community because we feel very alone. Even if we're not, our lens is based on trauma. And I spend a lot of time communicating to the Jewish community that we have allies, that we have friends, that the NAACP has reached out, the African American Christian Clergy Coalition has reached out, One Community has reached out, that we're not dealing with the situation alone. But it's not just for me to say, it's for those on here who have relations with your Jewish community, letting them know we're not dealing with this alone. We need some handholding because our lens is so deeply based on trauma, and we have a whole new lens, a whole new level of trauma that has been thrown on this. And frankly, like, some of the national tenor of how difficult it is, we try and disconnect that from the local reality here in Arizona, that we have support from local community partners, that we are being, receiving outreach from local organizations, different faith and ethnic and LGBTQ community partners who are supporting us through this difficult time. But for those who are on the Zoom, just figure out how to reach out to your Jewish community. It's Hanukkah. We'd love to hear from you. We got some extra latkes for you. We'll spin some dreidels, but just know, and not just for the Jewish community, it's also a very difficult time for the Muslim community, for the Palestinian community. I want to highlight that as well. They are also having a rough time. We keep some tacit communication with between the Jewish and Muslim community, and we know that it's not easy for them as well. And we don't have the same lens on what's going on, but together we can pray for peace, and that's something I just want to highlight. We have concerns about the safety and security of the Muslim community here in Arizona as well, and we try and maintain that just as we maintain the safety and security for all vulnerable communities in Arizona.
Thank you, Paul, and I just thank you for your empathy for the Muslim community here and for working side by side to create a safer state for all of us. Such a good example of we don't have to understand everything the same way, and we can still, like you said, pray for peace, for respect for our basic humanity for all people. So that's so powerful. We have covered a lot, and I know we're almost out of time. We're getting close here. I think we've got some thank yous from our audience for this incredible conversation. I just wanted to ask each of you, sort of as we get close to wrapping up here, can you just reflect a little bit on, I guess, sort of what has worked, what's been most powerful in your work for working against anti-Semitism, working against homophobia and transphobia, and then if we have time after that, we'll do what's the next things people can do, our audience can do, to honor everyone's collective humanity and step up for and be an ally, right? Be actionable allies. So first, what's been the most impactful strategy in your work?
Organizing. What is going to get us out of this is not a new policy on what the US government is going to do about extremism. It's going to be us building these bonds within our own communities, taking a strong moral stance. I can only echo Paul against the dehumanization of anyone, because we know that this type of rhetoric escalates. It goes in different directions. So whenever we're able to stand up for each other and, make sure that dehumanizing speech is not normalized against any community, that means that all of our diverse communities win.
Gosh, yes, I'm an organizer as well, so you're speaking to my heart. It's so important. Eddie or Paul?
Yeah, I think relationship building is what the number one way to combat hate in multiple communities. If I'm not there to say, hey, that's anti-Semitic, I remember being in a space of organizing where folks were thinking about a logo to collectively use for a coalition that was going to be brought up. And everybody came to the conclusion that they were going to use these certain logos. And those certain logos were the same thunderbolts that were used in the Holocaust. So, I politely was like, hey guys, this is a little anti-Semitic, maybe not a little, maybe a lot, like maybe we should rethink about these things. But if I'm not in the position of those space and those relationships, then I can't have those conversations. If I'm not in the positions to understand that my implicit bias might lead to a homophobic stance, then I can't have that. But to do that, you need to build relationships with communities. Collective allyship isn't just putting a sticker on your car and saying, love is love. Like it's so much more than that. It's standing up for your queer community members when queer community members aren't present. It's standing up for the Jewish community when it isn't present, when it feels like, it's not trendy. It isn't trendy. It's not what the trends are moving towards to stand with communities. And when it is, make sure it goes far beyond with that. In Judaism, one of my favorite teachings is Rabbi Akiva was talked about like what is the most important Jewish value, the most important Jewish like ethics or teaching. And he talked about the power of consistency. He talked about the power of consistent prayer and consistency, and how a single droplet of water consistently dropping on a rock can break that rock. So it goes to show us the power of consistency. And I want us to have that power when we think about what do we do with our community in times of tension? What do we do in community in times of conflict and stress? And how can we consistently bring each other in to say, I see you, I hear you, I humanize you. Here's some ways that we can stand with each other. That doesn't mean a call for violence on either side of where we are. That's how we can start to make some positive changes here. And that I feel like that falls into the line of anybody. I saw the question about politicians who, in my opinion, have good intentions, where we feel like everybody feels like they're in the right space, fighting the right fight. But I think that when we lean into and letting folks know, here's how this hurts me, here's how this hurts my community, and here's some pathways that can come and coincide and find some sort of middle ground or middle point for us to be able to say, hey, I agree with that. Those are kind of the paths that I see to be able to fix us. Yeah.
Thank you, Eddie.
Eddie, you raised a very good point about anti-Semitism is not a problem of the Jewish community. It's something we have to deal with, but it's a problem of the communities around us. And it's the problem of all other communities in pushing back against this, just as it's the Jewish community's problem that we have to help be there to stand against, LGBTQ hate. It's the Jewish community's problem that we need to stand against racism and systemic racism, Islamophobia. And sometimes that's having honest conversations with our own community and understanding that sometimes our own communities push some of these things in ways that are not helpful and dehumanize. Part of that is because of the lens of trauma, but it's our own responsibility both to deal with these things externally and internally. I'm kind of reminded in this of, something from the West Wing about this guy who falls down a hole, and he's down in the hole and he sees his friend walking up and he says, hey, help me get out of this hole. And the friend jumps in the hole and he says, what are you doing? Why'd you jump down this hole? And he says, well, I've been down this hole before and I know the way out. The Jewish community has been down this hole before. We know where this hatred leads. We're going to lead to get us out of this, and we're going to do it together. We're going to do it with a coalition of communities working together to stand against hate. But that comes from understanding the complexities of situations. That comes from understanding the complexity of conflicts, and that, if you've got an easy answer on something, you probably don't understand as well as you think you do. And I just, keeping an open mind and meeting people where they're at is one of the things that we've kind of talked about, and just holding complicated relations, but also understanding like there's a line. I mean, it was William Lloyd Garrison, that great abolitionist, who said, with reasonable men I will reason, with honorable men I will plead, but with tyrants I will give no quarter. And there are tyrants out there that we deal with. Here in Arizona, we've got a lot of them that are just never going to meet us where we're at, but we just have to be smart enough to know the difference and meet people where they're at and know who we'll never meet.
So I think y'all pretty much answered what can people do to be an actionable ally with that as well. Thank you. So I'm going to wrap in this last question from the audience. What can we do to help educate our legislators, especially our LGBTQ legislators, who maybe don't have enough knowledge about anti-Semitism, about the complexities of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, right? So that they can better understand this as elected leaders. And I'm going to ask you also to share one resource that will help our audience learn. So one thing, whether it's a book, a movie, a toolkit, anything. So Kate, you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess I would sort of echo Eddie on this one in pointing out that in the United States, none of us really have benefited from a deep education on anti-Semitism. So it's important to ask those questions, see why people got to the place that they got to, and also just make sure that we're drawing a strong moral line against dehumanizing folks, right? But yeah, I mean, I think we're in a place politically where it's incredibly difficult for people to decide what's the best thing to do, because in some ways there may not be any ideal options. As Paul was saying, this is very complex. For one thing to share, we actually do have a document coming out today, I'm hoping, that is called One Thing We Can Do. And it's all about how to do thoughtful messaging and organizing around this issue and keep our communities safe in this tough time.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Eddie and Paul?
For the legislators, I mean, so there was something that was signed by some of the Arizona legislators in the Democratic Party. And I want to be careful here. I don't think that everyone who signed it was either pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel. Sometimes there is a well-intentioned pursuit on things which doesn't live up to the complexity. I don't think every legislator who signed it understood the geopolitical realities of what they were dealing with. So I'm going to, again, give a little grace on this and just work to educate those either who signed it or who didn't sign it of some of our community's perspective and lens on this, just to help educate it further. And again, understanding that, you know, you sometimes get roped into signing on to things when you don't have a full, complete depth of it. And if you're an Arizona legislator, you might not be so up on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the levels of degrees, and so a little grace. Since we've been kind of talking a bit and around the Israeli-Palestinian issue, a resource I would recommend is a book called "O Jerusalem" by Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre. It reads like a novel, but it's historic. It's a historic book, and they were journalists, and they wrote about the partition of Palestine, between Israel and the Arab community of Palestine, what became Israel and what became part of Jordan, part of Egypt. That's a whole longer story, but it is a very good book that looks at, from the bottom to the top of what was going on at that time. And it's not written by anyone who is, Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian, Muslim. These are objective journalists as much as you ever get objectivity. It's a good resource for a quick dive into at least that one little piece of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from 1948. I mean, you can go back a lot more. It's a complicated conflict. I mean, there are plenty of people who've spent years and years and years studying, but "O Jerusalem" by Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre. When you're done with that, read "Freedom at Midnight," their book about the partition of India and Pakistan. That's all another story. Anyway, Eddie, yours.
Love that. Eddie?
Yeah, no, that's incredibly difficult, especially with Middle East conflict, and to be able to say, like, here's a point like educational toolkit, like, it's so difficult. And one thing I love about Judaism is that there is no one answer for something. There's like 75 different answers and takes and looks. Like, we have a whole book on analyzing, the Torah, the Bible. There's like a whole book dedicated of back and forth rabbis giving their takes. So like it's so difficult to really just provide one thing. But one thing I do really want to build and have us is work internally on our own implicit biases. Maryvale University, if you Google their program on implicit bias, it's completely free. It's a place to start with. And I think that when we retroactively look interiorly on what are we doing, what am I doing, how am I feeling, what are my actions doing, then it starts to lead into what are we walking with and how do we walk with those things. That leads to relationship building. I don't inherently think a lot of these politicians, when signing things, are really thinking like, I hate this community, or don't hate this community, right? Like, I don't inherently think that. And, that's the naive optimism that I may hold, but that's just me, right? Because I walk with this maybe percent naive optimism that I hold, that thinking that the world is a lot brighter than it might be, but that keeps me going, and that keeps me going in this world. And I think it's, no pun intended, but it's the light and that keeps me going as we get approaching to Hanukkah. Deep relationship building is what really changes the world, in my opinion. And I think it's what collectively keeps us going. Because when you hurt, I hurt. And when we try to challenge and truly dismantle tropes that really hurt our communities, relationships are the ones that dismantle that. Relationships are the ones that break those barriers down and help say, here's why this hurts me. And here's why, as your friend, I don't just see you as a digit or a thing or a cause of something, but I see you as a deeply hurt person by whatever's happened. That's where we start to make narrative change, my friends. That's where we start to collectively build a community that looks upon so much beauty within our compassion, our love, and our struggle to keep each other safe, healthy, and happy.
Well, thank you all so much for helping to educate me and our audience, for helping us to all lean into complexity and nuance and greater understanding instead of simplicity. I just want to thank each of you for the work that you do, because I know that the work you do every day makes this country safer for LGBT people, for Jewish people, for Islamic people, for all of us. And so I just am so full of gratitude for all of you and the work you do. And I hope that we can all get to a place where everyone's humanity is honored and respected. And I will definitely be praying for peace this season, and hopefully working towards it too. And so just thank you all for joining us. We have so many thank yous from the audience, so thank you. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Happy Hanukkah to everybody out there. Come
Happy
spin the
Hanukkah.
dreidel with us this Hanukkah season.
Absolutely.
Bubala, Michael, you get some latkes. We
I
got some
love it.
latkes for you, Bubala.
I can't wait. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you
everyone.
all. Shalom, friends.
Yeah.